I will never forget when this happened. I joined a program, and right at the beginning, as part of all the individuals that were going to be part of this journey together, training, learning together, and this was during my adult life, we all introduced each other to the group. And one of the individuals that was part of the group introduced themselves by sharing all of the qualifications, distinctions, and certifications that they held. So just used that as a pivotal part of introducing themselves. And I noted this. It stood out for the group, a few of us, but nothing was mentioned. And then right at the end, one of the things that this individual, after the entire program had been done, we all knew each other so much better. We had raised our levels of awareness because this program was all around the idea of raising your awareness, true transformation, the capacity to think about what you're thinking about. So all of those beautiful themes. And right at the end of the program, I will never forget, this individual stood up in the group and mentioned that one day when they were in primary school, early years of education, a teacher asked them to come up to the board and share an answer that the teacher, according to this person, knew that they didn't know. So the teacher made them do something that still to this day in their 60s is driving their constant need to be certified, to learn, to be educated, not because they have a hunger for learning, but because they've just been trying to prove themselves since that one day where they stood up in front of the class, didn't know the answer, and was made fun of. And that for me is one of those moments that stays in my head because it is a lesson, it is an anecdote for how, yes, there is potential for true growth in our education system. But more than anything else, like today's episode, there's more than one kind of smart. So let's talk about what that looks like. Welcome to this episode of the Unlearners podcast. The Unlearners. Learn, change, grow. Hi there, Unlearner. I absolutely loved starting off with that story because it just is a constant in my mind about just how powerful the schooling environment can be for individuals. I often say that school is where some of our deepest beliefs about ourselves, about others, about the world are both formed but also hardwired. The schooling environment, because of how much time we spend at school or in learning, especially in those early years, it literally is the breeding ground for some of the deepest beliefs that we carry throughout. And one of those is really rethinking what it means to be smart, what it means to be intelligent. So today on this conversation, as part of this theme of more than one way to be smart or more than one kind of smart, we're going to have the discussion of what is the biggest challenge here? What are some of the things that you and I, as various stakeholders of the education fraternity, can be thinking about? What are some of the conversations we can be having? What are the challenges that firstly we are coming across, and real challenges? I'm not talking surface level challenges that everyone throws around, but aren't actually complex. As someone who has previously been in a classroom as a full-time educator, these challenges are not surface. They are actually complex, and the teachers themselves, they see it. It's not the teachers are blind. And I think this is where anyone who points a finger at any one stakeholder within the greater ecosystem of education is at fault. And this is one of the things we're going to look at a little bit later on. So that's the one thing. We're going to chat a bit about those challenges. And then we're also going to talk about that story. we're going to just unpack, have a little bit of a conversation around how these labels and these definitions around being smart or intelligences that we build our curriculums around actually follow us into adulthood. And a lot of us are still carrying those. We're still carrying whether we were labeled as smart or not, or whether we were bullied because we were smart or not, or maybe because we were smart and we didn't have certain opportunities, or maybe all of these things, but also what it meant to be smart. And that, I think, for me, is one of the biggest things, is the meaning we attached to it, as a result of obviously the system that we were part of. And then the very last thing we're going to talk about, now what are some of the practical things that you and I can do? And I want these to be things that we think about in terms of not just what are the big conversations that need to happen at a parliamentary level or at a United Nations level. These are all granular things that you and I can do from today, because at the end of the day, it's the small things that are the big things. The big things are not the big things. The small things are truly where rapid and trackable transformation truly happens. So let's have that conversation. And maybe to start that off, one of the things that I think I want this episode to be focused on is you and I unlearning the belief that there is a fixed nature around intelligence, and almost being open to the idea that intelligence is unfolding before our very eyes, because not just of the growing nature of the human capacity through maybe our capacity now to be bionic with the integration of technology and all such things, but also there's so much that's changing in human beings genetically. Our ecosystems are literally at an epigenetic level affecting how we show up. So because the human being is an evolving creature in and of themselves, we cannot really be fixed. We cannot be so naive as to be fixed in our idea around what intelligence is. But having said that, it does become important in certain senses to go, okay, so how do we then measure? How do we then categorize? Or how do we then move ahead? Because those conversations also need to be had. So here's where I want us to start. So what are some of the key challenges? And I've got 3 on my list here, and I'd love to hear. Go over into the comments, shoot me a message, shoot me an email, and let's talk about what some of these are that you are identifying. Are there any of these that you have identified, whether it's in your role that you play across the education ecosystem, or maybe in your classroom or with your children, or maybe you tutor, or whatever it looks like for you? What are some of these challenges that you've seen? And 3 that I've identified. The very first one, and we did touch on this a little bit already, but it's the idea that the system is linear. And this is, I want to just be very, very objective here, but also subjective in a way, and you'll hear what I mean just now. The system is linear because it doesn't accommodate a flexible view on intelligence. Now, when I say flexible view on intelligence, there are many theories, there are many methodologies, there are many frameworks, and probably the most common one that many of us would have heard of, and that's actually quite prominent in the education space, is Howard Gardner's multiple intelligences, and he's got about 9 there. And basically, it just speaks about 9 distinct intelligences that form a spectrum for an individual. And this is just one model. And you may have heard also of the model around fluid and crystallized intelligence. And that's one that I often enjoy pulling from as well. But maybe to go all the way back to Gardner's multiple intelligences, this would list anything from your linguistic intelligence, which is your ability and your capacity to use language and exercise language effectively, to not only communicate but receive messages and engage with others. Another one that's also part of the 9 is musical intelligence. And what you start to see as you think about these, whether it's interpersonal intelligence is another one, spatial intelligence, etc., is how a lot of what we have today is based on that. And the way that it plays itself out in so many of our mainstream schools is through your subjects, right? Is through your various learning areas where, you've got your music class, and then you've also got what might be called your digital class or your computer class or whatever it may be called, depending on the different settings. So that's how it may play itself out. So in that sense, there is an inclusivity. However, what I mean by it's linear still and not as inclusive as it could be is because there is an unequal weighing of the different intelligences. So a musical intelligence in certain senses may not be seen in the exact same way or to weigh a very similar kind of weight as maybe, for example, to go back to Gardner's model, your logical mathematical intelligence, which is seen. And this is the big idea, is that there's still this perception that is held over us or lorded over us around what matters more, which form of intelligences are best. Now, whether that model works for you or not, I think it's one of the just examples that I thought to bring in there just to show what that might look like. However, having said that linearity, and this is where many of us might point to the schools and say, oh, teachers are not doing their best, or the education system is broken and the curriculum and this and that and the other. What I will say here, and this is really, really important to hear, it is extremely complex to create an environment that is truly inclusive. Because then what does that look like? And then how do you grade? And because usually the challenge becomes, yes, I want to create this model. And we would have seen a lot of schools that are alternative modes of schooling breaking out of the regular or the norm, then are still existing within a much larger macro system that is requiring a completely different level or has and holds a different perspective on intelligence from what the school is holding. So even if the children may start out, or the students, the learners may start out in that environment, they go into a world where they are judged or where they are categorized according to these stringent, very linear models. So there is a huge job here that our educators are going through, of really asking themselves what that true inclusivity looks like at a practical level, where we are doing justice by our learners, but we're also really being intentional about what the learners need, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on. So second challenge, so that's the first one, is that linearity and just how much inclusivity isn't quite there, especially when it comes to weighting of different intelligences. The second one is traditional schooling often labels students. And not with a malicious intent. And this, I think, is one of the things that, when you have conversations with parents, you hear a lot about this. Oh, the teacher said this and the teacher said that. And that may be the case, and I'm not dismissing that. However, there are what we can call almost invisible labels or intangible labels, if we can think about them like that, more figurative, more hidden, almost like your hidden curriculum, really, in a sense. But they're hidden labels that are, without an educator, without anyone in the ecosystem having to say, you are not good enough, the system itself implies the message because of how it's organized. And so if I'm sitting in a classroom and I'm not doing so well in maybe my sciences, and I might show up somewhere else, and maybe I'm noticing that when it's science time, all of those children get rewarded really well, and we, everyone gets these beautiful blue ribbons. But when it's time for music and we're all playing and I excel, maybe the same credibility or the same celebration isn't applied. And as a result of just picking up a pattern, because that's what human beings do. We pick up patterns and then we use those patterns to inform behavior. And so when a child is able to pick up, oh, yesterday that happened, and then that's how that child was rewarded. And today the same thing happened, and that's how that child was rewarded. Okay, so based on what I'm picking up, it must be that X equals Y. And so there is an inference or a relationship, a correlation that is created in the child's mind that then sticks a label on them, or that they then choose to stick a label on themselves. And it may not feel as selected by the child at the time, but because the child is just open to suggestion at the time, and they may have not have had or evolved at that level their capacity to be intentional with their choices and to protect what they're able to internalize in terms of their mental or psychological choices and patterning and conversations in their head. That's what they learn. They are learning at an incredible pace, especially in those younger years. So that's the second one, is that there are those unintentioned labels that start to form. And then the last of those three challenges, I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts on that label point. But then the very last of the challenges that I've got on my list here is, even though we do have alternatives, and this is the beautiful thing, I want to encourage that you listen to the episode with Mark Loon of Kairos School if you haven't as yet. Just one example around alternative schooling, but there are just multiple, so many, some global, well-known, others a little bit more niche, here and there, quite different, but there is choice now. But the challenge for me still remains is that even though we do have these alternatives, they're scattered, they're siloed, and they are seen to be quite slow to pick up. And these are all understandable, right? So the scattered nature of them is because it may come from individuals who have been within the mainstream ecosystem, who have realized some kind of gap or challenge that they've experienced in their own experience, and then branched off to start something that fits whatever criteria or model or framework they feel is best. And so they might start something in one corner, and then another person starts something in a different corner. But then the scattered nature of them also has a direct correlation with their siloed nature, because one person's doing that there, another's doing that there, but also we don't have, so much from what I've identified, the inclination to co-create, to collaborate, because we still have, to go right back to that first point, we still have a very wrong or right, in or out perspective. There still isn't so much fluidity or an allowance of more than one perspective, more than one model being okay. And this can speak to, yes, we do see it that way, but also maybe the silos are actually fine, because it does mean that there is more choice, there are more options out there. So I definitely do see both sides of that, right? Which is exactly this point, is the capacity to see the alternative views and not try to label them, but to say it's good for contrasting, contrary views to exist, and for individuals to be able to exercise their capacity for choice, or their willpower, or their own curiosity, right, that aligns with them and their context. And in the slowness of it, the slowness of some of these models, some of these schools that we may be seeing, some of these institutions that are doing things slightly differently, also is something that we can speak to, is how slow they are, not just in terms of building recognition, but in terms of picking up, in the sense that they're slow to establish themselves. They're slow to have an ownership of who they are, to build a brand that can be seen, that they can be confident in as well. But also the scale and the slowness is there as well, in terms of how whether it's how they think about enrollment, and they think about hiring, they think about putting systems into place. A lot of that does then stall, because, and this is what I've seen to be the case, especially across the continent of Africa, is because so many of them are independent. It does mean that issues like funding start to come into play, right? And so many other things, that because there are so many options in the market, it does tend to then stall that growth curve, so that it. There is a lot more to be done at the initial phases in order to drown out some of the noise, possibly of competitors or other players within the marketplace. So there are a lot of complexities that are involved in that. But I have seen and heard just about the slowness of growth, especially as your alternative schooling gains popularity, which I think is a fantastic thing because it does mean we're asking the questions that a lot of the populations across the globe are pushing back and rethinking, right? Because it's not so much about pushing back that we should be thinking. It's more about how do we build, because when we think about it in terms of fighting one thing, then we're defeating the purpose. You don't want to be anti, you want to be pro. So in our case with this conversation, you don't want to be anti-mainstream schooling. You want to be progressive, expansive, transformational schooling. That's the idea there. And although you may be against certain things, or you may disagree with certain parts of mainstream schooling, when you act from an energy of, I don't want this, this is not working, instead of, what do we need to build? Focus on what we're building. Because at the end of the day, the way that we unlearn anything is through learning something else. There are only two kinds of habits of doing and habits of not doing. And the way that habits of not doing get broken or get filtered is through habits of doing. And this is such a powerful thing for us to understand, because as long as we are still fighting against, we're not going to build progressively. And this is what I see a lot. There is that segmentedness within the industry because everyone is just going, let's break this down instead of let's build. Let's build what we know we want to have. And so I want to then branch into that. So let me know what you think of just those challenges. What are some of the challenges that I didn't mention that you think, oh, this is also another big one that I'm seeing that we're currently experiencing, especially as it comes to today's topic around how there's more than one kind of smart within our context. And these are the challenges that are actually getting in the way or creating that predicament. So before we go into a solution mode and thinking about, okay, what now? And I'll just share 3 pointers for that. I want to just go back to that story that I shared right at the beginning, and we'll call the individual Bob just for the sakes of this conversation here. So if we go back to the story of Bob, I want to just go back to it only to say that it's important for us, or regardless of what role you play within education at its various levels, to understand just how critical the schooling years are, not just for the growth of the human brain, and I won't use the word mind here, I'll use the word brain and neurology very purposefully, because at those subtle ages, not only are we developing our perspectives around the world. You're looking at your ages of 2 to 5, where we are also building our frameworks around access. What are the things I have access to and what are the things I don't have access to? But also, those are the ages when our prefrontal cortex is firing like crazy. We're learning all of the key frameworks for survival on the planet. We're learning how to organize. We're learning how to executively function in the practical sense. Yes, we have that capacity within our gray mats already, but now we're learning how to make this brain work for us in a practical sense. So all of that beautiful hard wiring is happening, and we know that it's happening at a pace that you never get back. I mean, from around the ages of 25 going onwards, we slow right down in terms of our capacity to truly learn at that level. We can still learn. The brain is always learning, as compared to what we used to think. What we used to believe is that at a certain age, the brain just stops learning, and now you are just mimicking out habits. But we know now for sure that we learn all the way through. In my native language of isiZulu, we say umuntu funda zafi, which means you learn all the way to the grave, baby. All the way. So yeah, that's what I wanted to just mention there, is that those labels, they move with us, and unless we are intentional and about we're intentional about our unlearning and transformational journeys, we will carry those labels that a teacher, that a principal, that a moderator, that a parent, that the government once supported through either a system or practically and physically actually contributed to. So that's something that's really important to remember. So this space is such a beautiful space to be a part of, because there's true magic to happen within the classroom. There's true magic that happens within any learning space, regardless of whether it's a classroom or it's an online course anywhere. It truly is just such a beautiful space, because there's a capacity there to truly form, to truly disrupt, and sometimes in a beautiful way, disrupt a person's patterning around how they see themselves, how they see others, how they see the world. So it's an honor to be involved within the education space because of the impact you get to have. So now let's close off then. And you can see I'm really passionate about this, because I could go on all day, all day about this. So now let's talk about my 3 sort of takeaways. Now what? Let's speak about how we can truly move from this place of a linearity around our perspective around intelligence and smartness, if we can think about it like that, and the idea that traditional schooling is intrinsically and possibly not even intentionally, labeling in so many different senses, but also how we carry these labels. What can you and I do? And at different levels, right? So we'll speak both. I mentioned that we're going to speak very micro, but also to speak about the big picture too. So 3 things, and I'd love to hear what you would have said. What are your now what's when it comes to this idea around multiple intelligence, integrating this, thinking about education that is truly, truly, truly inclusive? Okay, so 3 things. One is everyone. It's just going to take all stakeholders. And this is the one thing I heard someone say the other day, that, and we were speaking more, it was a conversation on healthcare, and they were saying that healthcare is a team sport, and I think education is very much the same as well. And I can almost bet that it is. It's a team sport. And when I say team sport here, I'm talking public, private sector, corporate, everyone, teachers, parents, all of it. But I'm also talking regulation, especially in the age of mind-blowing technological advancements. We are going to need everyone to pull together and be intentional about how we reimagine education. So that's the first thing. It's not going to be one person. And so if you're sitting there and you're pointing fingers, oh, they need to do this, oh, the government is not doing that, oh, this person's not doing, oh, the teachers don't care enough, what are you doing? That's my question. What are you doing? What role are you playing? And it's that understanding, or that wake-up call, or that smack on the face that says everyone is playing a role. And if you are going to relegate your role to an outside party, you are making a big mistake, because you are underplaying the role that you could potentially play. And I say pick up the reins that you have right in front of you, your own reins, and see what role you can play. So that's the first thing. Then the second thing is each person needs to take agency, quite closely related to that. First point was it's going to take everyone, all stakeholders, really thinking about the roles they can play. And then the second thing is each and every single person needs to take agency. We need to be asking ourselves, what role in my corner with where I'm involved? Am I a mentor of some sort? Do I teach a course? Do I take a course? What is the role that I am playing in education across the board in my own personal life? And in each of those engagements, with each of those stakeholders, with each of those learners, students, how do I play a role in my own corner? Because very much as we know, if you and I sweep in front of our own doors, then the whole world is going to be cleaner. I think it might have been Mother Teresa who said that. If we all sweep in front of our own doors, it sounds a little bit cheesy, but it's true. It really is the little things that create the big impact. So I want you to think about how wherever you are, and a lot of us that are listening to this possibly are not even involved directly within education, unless maybe we've got 1 or 2 children or a few children, or maybe nieces, nephews, grandchildren that are part of the education system. But whatever role you are playing, how can you take agency so that when you go to bed at night, you know you've played your role within the sphere of influence you have? Because often that's the pushback. Oh, I don't have much influence. Oh, I can't do much. Really, really, really. You should see my face now. Seriously, don't play the victim, because you're not a victim. Wherever you are, however you show up, there is something you can do, I promise you. And that takes us to the last point. And with this one, I want to actually share my personal experience around this. The last point, and I think you'll find this quite helpful, especially as you think about, okay, so what do I do? The last point is teach how and not so much what. My perspective is that education needs to teach children how to learn and not so much what to learn. It is the capacity to be able to learn that will serve our children, that will serve students, that will serve us well into the future. And so instead of focusing on information and reiterating or sharing information that is short-lived, that is not even relevant for a year at the pace of change in today's world, the most important thing we can do that will outlive any piece of information that you can share in a classroom or in a school or education setting is teaching skills, teaching capacity, because that they can apply across various contexts. And today, the capacity to unlearn and relearn, true to exactly what this conversation, this podcast, this entire season is all about, that's the skill, that's the meta skill. If we can focus in on teaching them how to learn, teaching the hidden curriculum of, hey, I get that we need to get through maths today, and that's fantastic, and we're going to do that. But in my method of how I teach you, in my method of how I help you with your homework, in my method of how I build the curriculum, if that's my role, in my method around how I draft this textbook or put this textbook together, whatever role you play, you know what role you play. In the way you do it, how are you teaching skills? How are you teaching capacity that outlives any kind of fixed information that is going to be frozen in a time frame? Because it's the skills that truly transcend the decades, that transcend the centuries. And if that is your focus, you will not go wrong. And so that's the thing. And I think that that's the note I wanted to close off on, because if you and I can think about that, teaching how to learn, and then we can go into our curriculum. Because very much as we've hinted already during this entire episode, the beautiful thing is we do have the capacity to do both. And yes, time does become a bit of an issue here and there. There's just so much to cover all the time and all of these expectations. And if you're in a classroom, you know exactly what I'm talking about. The overwhelm is explosive. Teachers are still, according to data, one of the most, and I hate to use this word because it's not a word I want to use, so I will avoid using it. Teachers still to this day are one of the professions that will choose to take their lives because of how overwhelmed they are mentally and psychologically. Because of how intense it is to teach, because of how intense it is to facilitate the learning and teaching paradigm within a child's life, within a group, within a school setting, across the board. And this is not just in one part of the world, but across the board. Teachers play such an important role. But a big part of it now, as we think about how inclusive we are when we show intelligence, or when we teach our children about intelligence, so that when they go out there, they have the capacity to go, regardless of who I am and how I show up and where I was born and what I have access to, I am smart, I am intelligent. And that doesn't have to look like the next person's intelligence or that person's intelligence or the intelligence of the cat or the intelligence of the fish. It's mine. It's personal to me. And I think when we apply the P's, whether it's the personalization in other sectors, we can apply it to education as well. Because in education, those are some of the key factors that contribute to how we redefine intelligence within education, but also we make it super practical in the classroom every single day. Because yes, it's going to take a while to truly get to mainstream schooling being inclusive of all form of intelligences. But until then, remember, what is your personal agency? Where do you have control? And then finally, how can you teach how to learn, whatever role you play, instead, or maybe not so much, what? Because yes, the what is important because it gives us context and it gives us the capacity to be able to apply our knowledge. So that's fantastic, and our skills. But more than anything else, teach the skill of learning, unlearning, and relearning. All right, unlearner. So that about wraps us up. We started our conversation with the story of Bob right at the beginning and how Bob, even in their 60s, still is carrying the labels of something that happened in early primary school, but also how that is a call for all of us, regardless of where we are within education, as a stakeholder, to think about the true inclusivity of intelligence or being smart or kinds of smart that we throw around, how they impact us. We spoke about the key challenges that we experience within how we make education truly inclusive and just how challenging and complex that truly is. And then we went into how those labels affect us. We went right back to the story of Bob and how those labels will stay with us and how those critical years are happening within the classroom. And as a result, the honor and the huge, unspeakable role that those of us in the education system are playing and have the potential and the ability to play. Quick recap then as we close off of those three now what's. What do we do now? And I'd love to hear some of yours as well. Please go over into the comments, over to social media as well, and share with us what those are for you that I may not have mentioned. So first one, everyone. It's going to take everyone. Education truly is a team sport. No one's going to do it alone. Second, take agency. Really exercise your agency, your accountability, your control within the greater ecosystem. And where you are, where is your control? Where does your control lie? And then the very last one is, let's focus on teaching the how, teaching the skills, teaching the capacity to learn, unlearn, and relearn. Because if our children, our students, our learners can learn how to learn, the actual skill of learning, and I'm not talking about regurgitating information. If they can learn how to learn, then that's a skill that will serve them for life. All right, Unlearner, that about wraps up today's episode of the Unlearners podcast, talking all about how we think about smarts, how we think about intelligence, because there's more than one kind. You know that song, almost sang that song, More Than One Kind of Love. But there's more than one kind of smart, and it is our responsibility to facilitate that, to introduce it, and to really be the pioneers wherever we are of an education system, of a world that truly sees that. All right, thank you so much, Unlearner. I can't wait to hear your thoughts on today's episode of the Unlearners podcast. It's been myself, Zanele Njapa, the Unlearning Lady. Bye for now. The Unlearners. Learn, change. Learn, change. The Unlearners.
The Unlearners. Learn, change, grow.